I woke up to the persistent beeping of machines and a dull, pounding headache that seemed to echo inside my skull. My entire body felt heavy, like I was tethered to the hospital bed by invisible weights. It took a moment for my blurry vision to focus on the sterile white ceiling above me, another to realize I wasn't at home. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the rhythmic hum of medical equipment filled the room. Where was I? What happened? I blinked, trying to piece together the fractured remnants of my memory. My name came back first, Greg Marshall. Age, 38. Beyond that, the details blurred. Something about a car, headlights flashing, and then nothing. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I struggled to sit up, only to find my arms tethered by 4 lines. "Easy now," a calm voice said. A woman in light blue scrubs appeared beside me. She had kind eyes framed by wire-rimmed glasses. "You're in the hospital, Mr. Marshall. You've been unconscious for over a day." Hospital? My throat was dry, my voice raspy. "What happened?" "You were in a car accident," she explained gently. "A pretty serious one. You were brought in late last night. It's a miracle you're alive." Her words sent a jolt through me. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remember. I had been driving. Yes, I'd been driving home from work. It had been late, close to midnight. I'd stopped at some Italian place. Laura loved their pasta. It was her favorite, and I'd wanted to surprise her. "Laura, my wife. Where's my wife?" I croaked, my heart racing now. "Is she okay? Did she?" "She was here earlier," the nurse said quickly, placing a reassuring hand on my arm. "She's fine. She came with a friend of hers, Thomas." I frowned, the name not registering. "Thomas?" "Yes, a tall man, maybe mid-30s? Dark hair." "He seemed very concerned about you." A knot of confusion tightened in my chest. I racked my brain, trying to recall anyone named Thomas in Laura's life. We had a close-knit circle of friends, mostly couples we'd met over the years at work events or through family gatherings. But Thomas? No one came to mind. "He said he's a close friend of Laura's," the nurse added. "They stayed until the early hours of the morning. Your wife wanted to make sure you were stable before going home." My stomach churned. Laura had never mentioned a Thomas before. Not once in the 8 years we'd been married. The idea of some close friend being by her side at such a critical moment felt off. I forced myself to push aside the unease. "And the accident?" I asked. "What exactly happened?" The nurse hesitated, then gestured to the remote lying beside my hand. "There's a call button if you need anything," she said. "But the doctors will be in shortly to go over everything with you. For now, just focus on resting." With that, she left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the relentless beeping of the heart monitor. I stared at the ceiling, frustration bubbling under the surface. I didn't even know where I'd crashed or how bad the damage was. The last thing I remembered was merging onto the highway, the smell of Laura's pasta wafting from the passenger seat. The memory brought a faint smile to my lips, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Thomas. The name nagged at me like a splinter lodged deep beneath my skin. I knew my wife well, her quirks, her habits, her friends. We had no secrets between us, or so I thought. It wasn't long before a doctor came in, clipboard in hand. Dr. Patel introduced himself and explained that my injuries, while serious, weren't life-threatening. A mild concussion, a few broken ribs, and a fractured wrist. "You were lucky," he said. "The car rolled several times, but your seatbelt and airbags likely saved your life." My head swam as I tried to process the information. Was there anyone else involved? Dr. Patel shook his head. "No, it was a single-vehicle accident. You swerved off the road and hit the guardrail. We're not entirely sure what caused it, but fatigue or distraction could be factors." I nodded numbly, grateful that no one else had been hurt. Still, his words did little to soothe the gnawing unease in my chest. Distraction. What had distracted me? I couldn't shake the sense that I was missing something important. After the doctor left, I drifted in and out of restless sleep, haunted by fragmented images of the crash, the screech of tires, the shattering of glass. and somewhere in the chaos, a fleeting memory of checking my phone. But why? I never texted while driving. It was a hard rule I'd set for myself after witnessing a fatal accident years ago. Yet, the memory was there, hazy but insistent. A brief glance at the screen, a message from whom? I bolted upright, the movement sending a sharp pain through my ribs. The nurse's earlier words echoed in my mind. She came with a friend of hers, Thomas. I couldn't ignore the unease any longer. Laura's face appeared in my mind. Her warm smile, her sparkling eyes, the way she'd laugh at my terrible jokes. She wasn't hiding anything. She couldn't be. Still, the name lingered. Thomas. It didn't fit. I needed answers. The soft shuffle of footsteps pulled me from my uneasy rest. The door creaked open, and there she was, Laura, my wife. Relief washed over me like a warm tide, and for a moment, all my earlier doubts seemed silly. But then, my gaze shifted to the man who stepped in behind her. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with a build that spoke of a gym routine more disciplined than mine had ever been. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with an air of confidence that felt out of place in the sterile hospital room. He wasn't family, wasn't a friend I recognized, and yet he moved with the ease of someone who belonged. "Greg," Laura said, her voice tinged with a nervous tremor. She rushed to my bedside, her hand reaching for mine. "Thank God you're awake." "Laura," I croaked, my throat dry and raw. "You're okay." Her eyes shimmered, and for a fleeting second, I saw nothing but love and concern in her expression. Then I caught the subtle glance she exchanged with the stranger. A glance too quick for most people to notice, but not me. "This is Thomas," she said, gesturing toward him. He was the first one to help after the accident. He stayed until the paramedics arrived. He's been amazing." Thomas stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Greg, glad to see you're awake. You gave us all a scare." I stared at him, the words slow to form in my head. My right hand, still aching from the fore, gripped his briefly. His handshake was firm, almost calculated. He didn't seem like someone just passing by the scene of an accident. His confidence felt too practiced, too rehearsed. "Thomas?" I murmured, testing the name on my tongue. "You were there." "I was driving behind you," he explained, his tone smooth and conversational. "I saw your car swerve, then hit the guardrail. I pulled over immediately. It was rough." His dark eyes flicked to Laura as he added, "Your wife got there shortly after. We called 911 together." Laura nodded enthusiastically, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I don't know what I would have done without him. He's been such a help, Greg." Her voice was full of earnestness, but her actions told a different story. She reached out, her fingers brushing Thomas's hand in a way that lingered just a fraction too long. A simple gesture of gratitude, perhaps, if it weren't for the way her cheeks flushed slightly when she pulled back. My chest tightened, the earlier unease curling back into a knot. "Thank you," I said, trying to sound sincere. "It's good to know someone was there." Thomas shrugged modestly. Anyone would have done the same. But not everyone would be here now, I thought, fighting to keep my face neutral. Why was he still involved? He wasn't family, wasn't a close friend. Hell, I'd never even heard of him before today. Laura launched into a flurry of reassurances. "Greg, he even helped me get in touch with the doctors. He's been such a rock. I don't know how to thank him enough." I watched her closely, noticing for the first time how her hands moved restlessly. Gestures that didn't match her usual composed demeanor. She twisted her wedding ring, then clasped her hands together, only to release them moments later. It was a nervous habit, one I'd rarely seen in her. My gaze shifted to Thomas, who stood at her side with an air of calm that made my stomach churn. He wasn't fazed, not even slightly. "Where was the accident?" I asked, cutting through her rambling. Laura's eyes darted toward Thomas, as if seeking permission to answer. "It was near Route 8, close to that overpass." That didn't sound right. I'd left the restaurant heading west. Route 8 was east. "Were you following me?" I asked, my voice low, directing the question to her. Or were you just nearby? Laura hesitated. I got a call from someone who saw the accident. I came as fast as I could. Who called you? Her gaze flickered to Thomas again. He smiled, the kind of smile meant to diffuse tension. It was me, he said smoothly. I saw her number on your phone and figured she'd want to know right away. That made sense, but something about it didn't sit right. You went through my phone? Only to find her number, he replied without missing a beat. Didn't seem like the time to be shy about it. Laura smiled at him, the gratitude evident in her expression. It was the right thing to do, Greg. He saved your life. Did he? Or was he just there? And why was Laura acting like they were old friends? I glanced at my wife again, and my eyes fell on her hand. It rested on Thomas's forearm, the gesture subtle but impossible to miss. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the behavior of someone thanking a stranger. This was something else. Well, I said, forcing a thin smile. Thanks again, Thomas. I think I've got it from here. Thomas raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Of course, I'll give you two some space. He patted Laura's shoulder as he stepped back. Call me if you need anything. She nodded, her hand lingering on his arm for just a moment too long. I watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him, and then turned my gaze back to Laura. Who is he? I asked bluntly. Her smile faltered. Greg, I told you. He's just a good Samaritan. Her words said one thing, but her face told a different story. The nervous way her eyes darted to the door, the way her hands fidgeted, the way she avoided my gaze. Right? I murmured, more to myself than to her. My ribs ached as I leaned back against the pillow, my mind spinning. I didn't know who Thomas was, but I was certain of one thing. He wasn't just a stranger. The hours after Laura and Thomas left the hospital passed in a haze. Nurses came in and out, checking my vitals and replacing 4 bags, but their voices barely registered. My mind kept replaying their visit, Laura's nervous gestures, the way she touched Thomas's arm, the silent looks that spoke volumes. Each time I tried to shake the thoughts away, they only came back stronger. As I lay in the quiet of the hospital room, flashes of memory started to surface, like fragments of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was trying to piece together. At first, it was a swirl of disconnected images. Headlights cutting through the dark, the smell of scorched rubber, and the screech of twisting metal. But then something else came back, something far more vivid. The Silver Gate Hotel. I could see it clearly now, the neon sign flickering against the night sky. It was the kind of place that catered to couples seeking discretion, not the setting for professional meetings or casual drinks. I hadn't planned to be anywhere near it that night. I was driving home, a bag of Laura's favorite pasta cooling in the passenger seat, when I spotted her car parked out front. Her car. There was no mistaking it. A sleek silver sedan with a small dent on the rear bumper, one we'd argued about fixing months ago. My pulse quickened as I replayed the memory. Why was Laura's car there, 5 miles from our house at a hotel like that? I remembered slowing down, pulling to the curb across the street. My headlights had caught them in the glow, Laura and Thomas, standing near the entrance. She was laughing, her head tilted back in a way that felt all too familiar. He stood close, his hand casually resting on her lower back. They weren't just talking. There was an ease between them, an intimacy I hadn't seen in my marriage in months. The memory sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. My hands had tightened on the steering wheel as I sat frozen, watching them. I told myself there had to be an explanation, something innocent, something I hadn't considered. But deep down, I knew better. That was when I grabbed my phone. I could still feel the weight of it in my hand, the sharp glow of the screen cutting through the dark interior of my car. I had opened a blank message, the cursor blinking impatiently as I typed. I saw your messages. Who is he, Laura? But I never hit send. Before I could, a set of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. I remembered glancing up, noticing the size of the SUV, Thomas's SUV. It matched the one I'd seen him drive before, the same one that had been parked near Laura's car at the hospital. The memory sharpened, and my breath caught. The SUV had moved closer, uncomfortably so. At first, I thought it was just an impatient driver trying to pass me, but then it clipped my bumper. A jolt ran through my car, and my heart leapt into my throat. I'd barely had time to react before the SUV clipped me again. Harder this time, forcing my car off the road. Everything that followed was a blur. The screech of tires, the crash of metal as I hit the guardrail, the world spinning as my car rolled. When the chaos finally stopped, all I could hear was the pounding of blood in my ears. My vision had blurred, my chest tight with pain. I tried to move, but darkness swept over me before I could even assess the damage. Back in the hospital bed, my hands clenched into fists as the memory played on a loop. Thomas's SUV. His car had deliberately hit mine. That much was clear now. But why? Was it a warning? A mistake? Or something worse? The idea sent a chill down my spine, but it wasn't as far-fetched as I wished it to be. Thomas had been there at the hospital, perfectly composed, perfectly helpful, perfectly calculated. And Laura, her behavior was so uncharacteristic it was almost surreal. She hadn't even asked about the accident in detail, hadn't questioned what caused it. Instead, she deflected, focused entirely on Thomas's role as her savior. I thought back to her nervous hands, the way she'd twisted her wedding ring while glancing at Thomas. It was almost as if they were waiting for me to forget, to dismiss the events as a tragic accident. But I couldn't. Not now. I reached for my phone, still lying on the side table next to the hospital bed. My fingers trembled as I unlocked it and scrolled through my messages. There it was, unsent but waiting. I saw your messages. Who is he, Laura? The question hung in the air, just as haunting now as it had been the night of the crash. I stared at it, my chest tight with anger and something else. Fear. Fear that the life I thought I knew, the woman I thought I knew, was unraveling before my eyes. I needed answers, and I needed them soon. Because this wasn't just about Laura and Thomas anymore. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was something far more dangerous. The hospital room was unbearably silent, the faint hum of machines doing little to ease the unease roiling in my chest. Every detail of the accident replayed in my mind like a tape stuck on repeat. Laura's car at the Silver Gate Hotel, her laughter with Thomas, his SUV clipping my car off the road. The pieces were falling into place, but I needed confirmation. I needed to know if my suspicions were justified or if the crash had scrambled my ability to think straight. I pulled out my phone, my fingers shaking slightly as I scrolled through my contacts. Kevin's name stared back at me. We hadn't spoken much recently, not out of any rift, but because life had pulled us in different directions. Kevin, 5 years older than me, had always been the guy who saw things clearly when I couldn't. After college, he'd built a career as a private investigator, thriving in a field that catered to people desperate for the truth. If anyone could help me uncover what was going on, it was him. The call rang twice before his deep, familiar voice answered. "Greg, man, it's been a while. How are you doing?" "Not great," I admitted, cutting straight to the point. "I'm in the hospital. Car accident." "What? Are you okay?" His tone immediately shifted to concern. "I'm alive, but that's not why I'm calling." I took a breath, steadying myself. "I need your help. Something's going on with Laura and this guy named Thomas. I think they're trying to pull something." Kevin didn't hesitate. "I'll come by. Give me a couple of hours." When Kevin arrived, he brought his usual no-nonsense demeanor with him. Dressed in a casual jacket and jeans, he looked like he could blend into any crowd unnoticed, an invaluable skill in his line of work. He pulled up a chair beside my bed and gave me a firm pat on the shoulder. "All right, start from the beginning," he said, pulling out a small notepad. I didn't hold back. I told him everything. The memories of the hotel, the accident, Thomas's too comfortable demeanor at the hospital, and Laura's suspicious behavior. Kevin listened intently, his pen flying across the paper. "Thomas," he said thoughtfully when I finished. "You said he was driving the SUV that hit you?" "Yeah, I'm almost certain." Kevin nodded, flipping to a fresh page. I'll dig into him. If he's as shady as he seems, I'll find out. In the meantime, keep an eye on anything Laura says or does. We need more than just your gut feeling. Left alone again, I decided to follow Kevin's advice. With nothing but time and a nagging sense of urgency, I turned my attention to my phone. I started with the draft I'd found before the accident. I saw your messages. Who is he, Laura? That unsent message had been weighing on me ever since I'd woken up, but now it sparked a new thought. Had Laura sent anything to Thomas that night? I scrolled through her text messages, but they were clean. Too clean. That was odd. Laura wasn't meticulous about deleting texts. She'd always left a trail of conversations with friends and family. Why was her thread with Thomas empty? Next, I opened my banking app. If there was something going on, there might be a financial trail. It didn't take long for the irregularities to jump out. Several transactions over the past few months were to businesses I didn't recognize. A boutique law firm, a private consultation service, and one that stood out most of all, multiple payments to the Silvergate Hotel. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. There was no way these payments were legitimate. Laura never mentioned staying at the Silvergate, and the amounts, often several $100s, didn't align with anything innocent. My pulse quickened as I dug deeper. A sinking feeling hit me when I opened my emails drafts folder. I found a scanned document labeled Power of Attorney. My name was at the top, but the details made my stomach drop. It was a fake, a document that gave Laura full control over my finances if I became incapacitated. My supposed signature was scribbled at the bottom, but I knew it wasn't mine. I clenched the phone tightly, the betrayal cutting deeper than I'd thought possible. Laura wasn't just lying to me. She was setting up a future without me, a future where she had complete control, and Thomas was somehow tied to it all. The next day, Kevin called with an update. "I've got something," he said, his voice grim. "Thomas isn't just some helpful bystander. He's a consultant, sure, but not the good kind. His specialty is divorces and business disputes. He's been accused, though never convicted, of forgery, blackmail, and coercion. The guy's reputation is about as clean as a landfill." My grip on the phone tightened. "You're saying he's done this before?" "Exactly. From what I've found, he helps people win their cases, but his methods aren't legal. It's all under the table. Fabricating evidence, doctoring documents, that sort of thing." I swallowed hard, the pieces falling into place. "And Laura?" Kevin sighed. "If she's working with him, it's bad news. I'm guessing that fake power of attorney you mentioned isn't the only thing they've cooked up. You're the target here, Greg." The room spun as the weight of Kevin's words sank in. Laura wasn't just cheating on me. She was conspiring with Thomas, possibly to take everything I had. The fake power of attorney, the hotel, the accident, it wasn't coincidence. It was a calculated plan. Kevin's voice softened. "Look, man, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but now that we know, we can fight back. You're not alone in this." I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "Thanks, Kev. I don't know what I'd do without you. Just sit tight. I'll keep digging into Thomas. In the meantime, don't let Laura know you're on to her." As I hung up, a cold determination settled over me. Laura and Thomas thought they had me cornered, but they were wrong. I wasn't going to let them destroy my life. Whatever they were planning, I would expose it. And when I did, they'd regret ever underestimating me. I sat in my car across the street from the coffee shop, my pulse pounding in my ears. Laura and Thomas were seated at a corner table by the window, leaning in close over steaming cups of coffee. The intimacy between them sent a fresh wave of anger surging through me, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't let emotions cloud my judgment now. This was about getting proof, about exposing whatever plan they had cooked up before they could ruin me completely. My phone was tucked discreetly into the pocket of my jacket, recording everything through the small, nearly invisible camera I'd rigged into the fabric. Kevin had provided the gear. It was simple but effective. I adjusted my earpiece, ensuring I could hear their conversation clearly. Then I slipped out of the car and into the coffee shop, my cap pulled low over my face. The place was bustling, the scent of fresh espresso and baked goods filling the air. I positioned myself at a table a few feet behind them, careful to stay out of their line of sight. My heart raced as I adjusted my phone's position, ensuring it captured their faces. I ordered a coffee to avoid suspicion and settled in, straining to hear over the clatter of cups and the chatter of other patrons. "Can't believe he's already asking questions," Thomas was saying, his voice low but sharp. Laura fidgeted with her cup, her fingers trembling slightly. "I told you he'd figure it out. Greg's not stupid, Thomas. He knows something's wrong." Thomas smirked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Relax, Laura. Even if he suspects, he doesn't have anything concrete. We're still in control." Her eyes darted nervously around the room, and she leaned in closer. "But what if he digs deeper? What if he finds, the documents? Or worse, the accounts?" Thomas shrugged, his confidence maddening. "Then we freeze everything like we planned. He'll be stuck, no access to his money, no leverage. He'll be scrambling just to keep up." I clenched my fists under the table, struggling to stay calm. They weren't even trying to hide their intentions anymore. Freezing my accounts? Stripping me of every resource I had? This wasn't just a betrayal. It was calculated destruction. Laura bit her lip, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And escalation? You said before, if it comes to that, then we escalate," Thomas interrupted, his tone chillingly casual. "If Greg keeps pushing, we'll make sure he can't." Laura's face paled. "What does that mean? You're not talking about—" "Thomas, we can't. We can and we will if it comes to that," Thomas said firmly. "You know what's at stake. Do you really want him to ruin everything we've built?" My breath caught in my throat as the implication hit me. They were talking about getting rid of me not just financially but physically. Laura's nervous reaction confirmed that this wasn't some offhand threat. Thomas was deadly serious. Laura looked down at her cup, her voice trembling. "I don't know, Thomas. This wasn't supposed to go this far." Thomas reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. "It'll be fine, Laura. As long as we stick to the plan, Greg won't be a problem much longer." I'd heard enough. My blood boiled as I stood, forcing myself to keep my steps steady as I approached their table. Laura spotted me first, her eyes widening in shock. Thomas turned, his confident smirk fading as he saw me standing over them. "Greg," Laura stammered, yanking her hand away from Thomas's. What are you doing here?" I pulled out my phone, my hand steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "Recording your little conversation," I said coldly. "Everything you just said about freezing my accounts, your so-called escalation. It's all here." Thomas's face hardened, his confident demeanor slipping. "You've got nothing, Greg. People won't believe a shaky recording in a noisy coffee shop." "Maybe," I replied, my voice calm and measured. "But it's not just the recording. I've got the fake power of attorney you forged, the bank transactions you've been funneling through the Silvergate Hotel, and proof that you've been blackmailing people for years. All of it's going to the police." Laura's face went pale. "Greg, wait. You don't understand. It's not what it looks like." "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," I snapped, glaring at her. "You've been conspiring with this snake to steal everything from me. And when that wasn't enough, you started talking about killing me." "That's not true," she cried, her voice trembling. "Thomas, he's the one who—" "Don't you dare try to pin this on me," Thomas growled, standing up. His towering frame loomed over the table, but I didn't flinch. "You were all in from the start, Laura. Don't pretend you weren't." Their alliance crumbled in an instant, their mutual blame spilling out in angry whispers and frantic accusations. I stood back, watching as they tore into each other, their carefully constructed facade crumbling. Finally, I stepped closer, my voice cutting through their argument. "I've heard enough. The authorities will take it from here." Thomas's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. Laura, tears streaming down her face, reached for me. "Greg, please. Don't," I said, my voice cold. "You made your choice." I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The weight of betrayal pressed heavily on me, but for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of control. They tried to destroy me, but I wasn't the one left exposed. They were. The betrayal had left scars, but I wasn't going to be the victim. The moment I walked out of the coffee shop, my focus sharpened. Laura and Thomas had tried to dismantle my life, but they hadn't counted on my resolve, or the fact that I wasn't alone in this fight. Kevin met me later that evening at his office. A small but well-equipped space filled with filing cabinets, computers, and a whiteboard covered in case notes. His expression was grim as I laid out the recording, forged documents, and everything else I'd uncovered. We had more than enough evidence to show that Laura and Thomas were up to no good, but the next step was critical. "This is good," Kevin said, nodding as he reviewed the materials. "Really good. The call recordings, bank transactions, and fake power of attorney paint a clear picture. But if we're going to nail Thomas, we need one more thing. Something that shows he's actively committing a crime, not just planning one." "Like what?" I asked. Kevin tapped his pen against the desk. "He's clearly motivated by money. If we set up a trap that lures him into transferring funds or committing fraud in real time, that'll be the smoking gun we need. And with the evidence you've already got, the police won't hesitate to act." The plan took shape quickly. Kevin created a fake investment account under a shell company name, complete with fake records showing a high-yield return. The account was designed to look legitimate on the surface, but it was a trap. If Thomas transferred money into it, he'd leave a digital trail linking him directly to fraud. "I'll make sure the police are ready," Kevin said. "Once Thomas bites, they'll have all they need to move in." The next day, I sent a message to Thomas, posing as a potential client through a burner phone. Using information Kevin had gathered about Thomas's usual schemes, I presented myself as someone looking for a consultant to move funds discreetly. Kevin had coached me on the language to use, just vague enough to sound plausible but with clear implications of illegality. Thomas replied within hours, clearly intrigued. "What kind of funds are we talking about?" he texted. "Substantial," I responded. "We'd like to avoid scrutiny, of course. We heard you're the guy for this." He bit. Over the next few days, we communicated back and forth, building a rapport. I hinted at needing to move the funds into a secure, high-return account, and Thomas eagerly offered his services. It wasn't long before he agreed to transfer money into the fake investment account Kevin had set up. When the transfer finally happened, Kevin and I were ready. The transaction was flagged immediately, and Kevin sent the records to the police, along with everything else we'd collected. The timing couldn't have been better. The police had already been reviewing the case based on the forged documents and Laura's suspicious activity. This new evidence sealed the deal. The morning of Thomas's arrest was both nerve-wracking and cathartic. I stayed at Kevin's office, watching the events unfold from a safe distance. Kevin had a contact in the police department who kept us updated in real time. "They've got him," Kevin said, grinning as he hung up the phone. Thomas was arrested at his office. They caught him completely off guard. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "What about Laura?" "She's being questioned," Kevin said carefully. "The police are focusing on Thomas for now, but with her name on some of those documents, she's not in the clear." The news brought a mix of emotions, relief that Thomas was finally out of the picture, and sadness that it had come to this with Laura. She wasn't the woman I thought she was, but she'd been a part of my life for so long. The idea of her facing legal consequences wasn't satisfying. It was just hollow. Days later, I sat across from my lawyer, reviewing the final pieces of the case. The bank accounts were unfrozen, the forged documents invalidated. Laura had been named as a co-conspirator but had agreed to cooperate with the authorities to avoid harsher charges. "She tried to paint herself as a victim," my lawyer explained, said Thomas manipulated her, pressured her into going along with his schemes. I scoffed, shaking my head. "That doesn't excuse what she did. She knew exactly what she was doing." Still, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing Thomas wouldn't be walking free anytime soon. The charges against him were significant: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and even attempted manslaughter once the evidence from my car accident came to light. The SUV that had run me off the road? It had been rented under Thomas's name, an oversight in his otherwise meticulous planning. The aftermath was a whirlwind of emotions. Laura and I finalized our divorce, and though the process was painful, it brought closure. I'd been blindsided by betrayal, but I refused to let it define me. With Kevin's help, I rebuilt what they had tried to take from me, piece by piece. As for Thomas, his smug confidence was nowhere to be found when he appeared in court. The evidence we'd gathered was overwhelming, and his attempt to downplay his involvement only made him look worse. He was sentenced to several years in prison, and I made sure to attend the sentencing, if only to see the look on his face when the judge read the verdict. Walking out of the courthouse that day, the weight I'd been carrying for weeks finally lifted. Laura and Thomas had underestimated me, believing I'd fold under their schemes. But they were wrong. I wasn't broken. I was free. It was late evening when I heard the knock at the door. The sound was firm and deliberate, cutting through the quiet stillness of the house. I had been sitting in the living room, absently flipping through a book while waiting for the inevitable. The evidence Kevin and I had collected had done its job, and now it was time for Laura to face the consequences. Still, when the knock came, my heart thudded in my chest. Laura appeared from the kitchen, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked casual, almost carefree, as though she hadn't been implicated in a scheme to destroy me just days ago. Her expression shifted when she saw my tense posture. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice carrying a nervous edge. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood and walked toward the door, steeling myself. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood on the porch, their expressions professional but firm. Behind them was an unmarked car, its lights casting long shadows across the driveway. "Mr. Marshall," one of the officers said, "we're here to execute an arrest warrant for Laura Marshall." Laura froze behind me, the color draining from her face. What is this?" she stammered, setting the wine glass on the counter with trembling hands. "Greg, what's going on?" I stepped aside, letting the officers in. "You know exactly what this is, Laura." "No," she said quickly, her voice rising in panic. "This is a mistake. Greg, you don't have to let them do this. We can fix this. We can fix everything." The officers moved toward her, but she took a step back, her eyes locking onto mine. "Greg, please," she pleaded. "You don't have to do this. You can stop this. We can go back to the way things were. Forget about Thomas. Forget about everything. It doesn't have to end like this." Her words hit me like a wave, filled with desperation and a trace of the charm that had once made me fall in love with her. But they were empty now, hollow echoes of the lies she had been feeding me for months. I couldn't unsee what she had done. I couldn't unknow the betrayal, the conspiracy, or the chilling plan to strip me of everything, even my life. "You want me to forget?" I asked, my voice cold. "Forget how you forged my signature? How you funneled money out of our accounts? How you conspired with Thomas to ruin me? You didn't even blink when he suggested escalating things, when he suggested I might not survive." Laura's breath hitched, and her eyes darted to the officers, who were now flanking her. "Greg, it wasn't like that," she said, her voice trembling. "Thomas, he manipulated me. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I shook my head. Don't you dare try to make yourself the victim in this." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't let them sway me. I'd seen the real Laura, the one who laughed with Thomas at my expense, who conspired to rob me of everything, who was perfectly content to watch me suffer. Those tears weren't for me. They were for her, for the realization that her carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling. "Mrs. Marshall," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "you're under arrest for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." They recited her rights as they cuffed her hands behind her back. Laura didn't resist, but her wide eyes remained fixed on me. "Greg," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please." I didn't respond. Couldn't. Watching her being led out of the house felt surreal. like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was my life, fractured but finally free from the weight of her deceit. The unmarked car pulled out of the driveway, its taillights disappearing into the night. I stood in the doorway, staring into the darkness long after they were gone. A strange quiet settled over the house, a quiet that was both liberating and unsettling. For years, I had thought Laura was my partner, my anchor, the person I could trust above all else. But the Laura I had loved was a fiction, a mask she had worn until it no longer served her purpose. The woman behind that mask had betrayed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. The fallout was swift. Thomas and Laura both faced serious charges, and with the mountain of evidence Kevin and I had provided, their defenses crumbled quickly. Thomas's schemes were exposed in court, revealing years of fraudulent activity and blackmail. Laura's involvement, while less extensive, was damning enough to earn her a significant sentence. She had forged documents, diverted funds, and willingly participated in a conspiracy that could have cost me everything. I attended the trials not out of spite, but to see justice served. Thomas, his smug confidence shattered, received a lengthy prison sentence. Laura's fate was less severe but no less final. As the judge handed down her sentence, she turned to me one last time, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," she mouthed, her voice lost in the noise of the courtroom. But sorry wasn't enough. Not anymore. In the weeks that followed, I began the slow process of rebuilding. Kevin stuck by me, offering both his professional expertise and the unwavering friendship I'd relied on since college. My finances were restored, the forged documents nullified, and my life was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. But I was different now, stronger, wiser. The betrayal had scarred me, but it hadn't broken me. Laura and Thomas had underestimated me, believing they could manipulate and destroy me without consequence. They were wrong, and as I stood in the quiet of my home, finally free from their shadow, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the victim of their story. I was the survivor of my own.